The streets of the French capital are restless, alive with a fever that has little to do with war or politics. It is money, or more precisely, the promise of it, that stirs the crowd. Rumors ripple from coffee house to salon, from market stalls to the corridors of the royal court. Fortunes, people whisper, are being made overnight. A common tailor has become wealthier than a duke. A widow, once destitute, now rides through the city in a gilded carriage. The source of this sudden prosperity? Shares in a company with a name as grand as its promise, the Mississippi Company. At its heart is a man of paradoxes. John Law, a Scottish exile, gambler, duelist, and visionary economist. He has convinced France that he can do what kings and ministers had failed to achieve for decades: erase crushing national debts and make the country rich beyond imagination. His weapon is not gold or silver, but something far more radical: paper money. For a time, it seems to work. France, drowning in debt after Louis XIV's wars of glory, finds sudden relief in Law's financial alchemy. Shares in his company soar. Paper notes circulate like magic, and Paris transforms into a marketplace of dreams. The world watches in awe as a new kind of wealth emerges, seemingly without limit. But beneath the frenzy lies fragility. The riches of Louisiana, fertile lands, gold mines, and trade monopolies, exist more in imagination than reality. And like every mirage, the closer one approaches, the faster it dissolves. By 1720, the promise of paper gold will collapse into chaos. Fortunes will vanish, riots will erupt, and France's trust in money itself will shatter. The Mississippi bubble is more than just a financial disaster. It is a warning across centuries, echoing into every market mania that followed, from the South Sea bubble to the housing crash of 2008. This is the story of how France gambled away an empire, and how one man's dream of endless wealth nearly toppled a kingdom. The year is 1715. France is in mourning. The Sun King, Louis XIV, has died after a reign that lasted 72 years, the longest in European history. His passing leaves a vacuum not just of power, but of solvency. For all his brilliance and grandeur, Louis left behind a nation suffocated by war and extravagance. The wars of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, had drained France's coffers. The military campaigns that once projected French glory across Europe now revealed their true cost. By the time of his death, the crown owed more than 3 billion livres in debt, an astronomical sum for the era. Annual revenues were dwarfed by the interest alone. The economy was crippled. Farmers struggled under heavy taxes. Artisans saw demand collapse, and trade slowed to a crawl. Worse still, confidence in the monarchy's ability to manage money had all but evaporated. The coinage system, reliant on silver and gold, was unstable. Kings had long engaged in the practice of recoinage, reducing the precious metal content of coins while keeping their face value the same. This debasement created constant suspicion, making people reluctant to use official currency. Hoarding of precious metals became common, further choking circulation. France was in a bind. To service the debt, the crown raised taxes, but this only deepened popular resentment and strained the economy further. Attempts to secure new loans failed, as creditors doubted whether they would ever be repaid. The monarchy's finances resembled a ship taking on water faster than it could be bailed out. Into this storm stepped the regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orléans. With Louis XIV's heir, the future Louis XV, still a child, the regent governed in his place. Orléans inherited not just the throne's authority, but its ruinous balance sheet. He and his ministers knew that unless something radical was done, the French state risked insolvency. It was at this moment of crisis that a stranger's ideas began to circulate. A Scotsman, with a reputation as much for gambling tables as for economic theories, was whispering of a system that could do the impossible: rescue France from financial collapse without raising taxes or cutting spending. A man who claimed to have found a way to conjure prosperity out of thin air by freeing money itself from the shackles of metal. His name was John Law. For the regent, desperate and cornered, the timing could not have been more perfect. France was on the brink, and the promise of salvation lay in the hands of an exile with radical dreams. John Law was not the sort of man one expected to become the architect of a nation's financial system. Born in Edinburgh in 1671 to a family of goldsmiths and bankers, he grew up surrounded by money, but possessed a restless spirit that sought excitement more than security. He was tall, charming, and strikingly intelligent, but also reckless. At just 23, he killed a man in a duel over a woman, fled England with a death sentence hanging over him, and began a life of exile that would carry him across Europe. In the gambling houses of Venice, Genoa, and Amsterdam, Law refined not just his taste for cards and dice, but also his understanding of probability, risk, and the psychology of chance. He saw money itself as a kind of wager, a system built not just on metal, but on trust and perception. It was in Amsterdam, the beating heart of European trade, that he studied the Dutch Republic's financial innovations, the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, the flourishing stock market, the trade companies backed by shares rather than royal fiat. These institutions had transformed the Netherlands into a global economic power. Law absorbed these lessons but went further. He became convinced that money did not need to be tied rigidly to gold or silver. In his eyes, precious metals were scarce, often hoarded, and limited the true potential of commerce. If only money could be detached from metal and replaced with paper notes, backed by trust and managed responsibly, then economies could expand without constraint. Credit, not coin, was the true engine of wealth. For years, Law hawked his ideas across Europe, writing treatises and approaching rulers with proposals to reform their finances. Most laughed him off. To them, money was real only when it clinked in the hand. Paper seemed too flimsy, too risky, too easy to abuse. But Law persisted, honing his theory that a national bank issuing paper money could increase liquidity, stimulate trade, and reduce the crushing weight of debt. By 1715, Law's wandering brought him to France, a nation gasping under the weight of Louis XIV's legacy. The regent, Philippe d'Orléans, was searching desperately for solutions. Law, with his mixture of charisma, intellect, and gambler's bravado, made an impression. He explained that France was not poor. It was simply trapped by its dependence on metal currency. He argued that rulers should release money from its prison, and commerce would flourish, tax revenues would grow, and debt would become manageable. The regent listened. Unlike many ministers, Orléans was open to bold ideas and perhaps to risk. He granted Law permission to establish a private bank in 1716, the Banque Générale. This was no ordinary institution. It issued banknotes that were accepted in payment of taxes, something revolutionary in France. Suddenly, pieces of paper, lighter, easier, and more flexible than coins, became trusted instruments of exchange. Confidence began to rise. Merchants found credit easier to obtain. Trade stirred. Law's star was rising. The Scottish exile who had once fled a gallows was now dining with princes and shaping the destiny of a kingdom. But he was only just beginning. The true test of his ideas would come not with banking alone, but with an audacious plan to merge finance, colonial ambition, and speculation into one colossal enterprise. It was a plan so dazzling, so seductive, that it would soon capture all of Paris in its grip. And its name was the Mississippi Company. In 1716, under the regent's blessing, John Law's grand experiment began. The Banque Générale opened its doors in Paris, a modest institution with revolutionary ambitions. Unlike the traditional money changers and financiers of the time, Law's bank was designed to issue paper banknotes backed by deposits of coin and, crucially, guaranteed by royal authority. This was not entirely without precedent. Paper notes had circulated in parts of Asia for centuries, and Amsterdam's exchange bank had issued receipts for deposits. But in France, the concept was radical. People were accustomed to gold and silver as real money. The idea that paper could hold value was unnerving to many. Law's genius was to make his bank's notes acceptable in payment of taxes. This gave them legitimacy. If the state accepted them, then surely they were trustworthy. At first, the impact was subtle. Merchants found that notes were easier to carry than heavy bags of coin. Transactions became smoother, and trust in the new paper spread. As confidence grew, more people deposited their coins in exchange for notes. Money, once hoarded in cellars, began to circulate again. Trade revived, markets bustled, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though John Law had discovered an economic elixir. But Law was never content with half measures. His vision was larger than just banking convenience. He saw money as the lifeblood of commerce, and commerce as the engine of national power. France, he argued, could escape its crushing debts if it tied its monetary system to a grand commercial enterprise, one that would generate wealth not only in paper, but in reality. That enterprise was to be the Compagnie d'Occident, soon to be better known as the Mississippi Company. Established in 1717, the company was granted exclusive rights to trade and develop the vast French territories in Louisiana. On paper, Louisiana was a land of unimaginable riches, fertile fields, vast forests, and rumored veins of gold and silver waiting to be tapped. In truth, little of this wealth was proven, but the promise was intoxicating. Law proposed a daring fusion. His bank would issue notes. Those notes could be used to buy shares in the Mississippi Company, and the profits of colonial trade would sustain the entire system. It was a self-reinforcing loop: credit fueling investment, investment fueling expansion, expansion fueling wealth, and wealth justifying ever more credit. By 1718, the experiment reached a new level. The Banque Générale was transformed into the Banque Royale, with the king himself guaranteeing its notes. What had begun as a private venture was now fused with the machinery of the state. Law, once a fugitive gambler, now stood at the heart of France's financial system. The stage was set. With paper money circulating, confidence rising, and a glittering colonial company to capture the imagination of investors, Paris was about to erupt into one of the greatest financial frenzies the world had ever seen. By 1718, the Mississippi Company had captured the imagination of all of Paris. Promises of wealth poured from the banks of the Mississippi River like the very waters that supposedly carried gold and silver. Investors of every rank, aristocrats, merchants, and even artisans, believed that fortunes could be made overnight. The company's charter granted it monopolies on trade in Louisiana, West Indies, and other French territories, creating an aura of exclusivity and inevitability. John Law cleverly tied the national debt into the company's operations. The French government, burdened by years of overspending, agreed to exchange its massive debt for shares in the Mississippi Company. In theory, this was brilliant. Creditors would hold stock instead of IOUs, and the company's profits from Louisiana trade would eventually cover the nation's obligations. By converting debt into equity, France could reduce immediate fiscal pressure, while investors imagined multiplying their wealth as the company's value soared. But the Louisiana territory was far from the gold-laden paradise advertised. Its swamps, forests, and rivers were difficult to navigate, settlements were tiny and underdeveloped, and rumors of precious metals were speculative at best. Law did not hide these facts, but he relied on public imagination. Through newsletters, letters, and lavish public announcements, he crafted a vision of a vast empire teeming with wealth. The idea was irresistible: a distant land full of gold, with shares easily purchased using the very banknotes his bank had issued. Speculation exploded. Shares rose rapidly, not because of real profits, but because new investors believing in the promise of Louisiana bought in at ever higher prices. Aristocrats flaunted their stock holdings in salons. Common citizens hurried to acquire notes to invest. In the streets of Paris, every cafe and tavern buzzed with rumors. A single share, once modest, could now buy a townhouse or a carriage. Wealth was being imagined into reality, and the paper notes, seemingly magical, were the fuel for this economic fire. Law's system also cleverly created artificial scarcity. By controlling the issuance of shares and the timing of new notes, he could maintain a sense of scarcity and desirability. People feared missing out, and that fear drove prices even higher. The entire economy began to revolve around a single vision, the Mississippi Bubble. Behind the scenes, however, fragile cracks were forming. The Louisiana colony struggled to generate actual revenue. Merchants realized that profits were not keeping pace with the soaring share prices. Still, the frenzy continued, largely because the value of Law-S banknotes depended on continued belief in the system. Trust became as tangible as gold, and the nation's faith in paper money hung by a thread. By the end of 1719, Paris was fully consumed by what came to be remembered as the Mississippi Dream, a heady mix of colonial ambition, financial innovation, and human greed. Yet as with all dreams built on illusion, the closer investors got to the reality of Louisiana, the faster the mirage would dissolve. By the autumn of 1720, whispers of doubt began to ripple through Paris. At first, they were faint, a cautious merchant here, a skeptical aristocrat there. But as share prices continued their dizzying ascent, the first cracks in the Mississippi Bubble became impossible to ignore. Investors, previously blinded by euphoria, began to question whether the glittering promises of Louisiana matched the reality on the ground. Reports trickled in that the colony's production was far below expectations. Tobacco, timber, and fur exports were modest, while rumors of gold veins proved unfounded. For every triumphant announcement Law released, a quieter truth persisted. Profits were not keeping pace with skyrocketing share prices. Yet for the masses swept up in speculation, the allure of wealth proved stronger than facts. Faith in the system had become a currency of its own. Pressure grew on the Banque Royale. Investors who had once eagerly exchanged notes for shares now sought to redeem paper money for coin. Law's carefully orchestrated supply of notes and shares could not keep up. The bank attempted to stabilize the system by limiting withdrawals and issuing decrees reassuring the public. But with each restriction, suspicion deepened. Confidence, once boundless, began to waver. Even among Law's closest allies, unease was spreading. Advisors cautioned that the system relied entirely on public trust and perception. The slightest panic could trigger a collapse. A fear that had seemed distant during the frenzy now loomed ominously. Social tensions began to surface. Street chatter shifted from boasting about fortunes to nervous speculation about the bubble bursting. Cafes, once alive with celebration, were now shadowed by apprehension. Meanwhile, Law remained outwardly confident. In public appearances, he reassured citizens, ministers, and investors alike that the system was sound. He doubled down on propaganda, publishing glowing reports and emphasizing Louisiana's potential. But the complexity of the scheme had grown beyond any single person's control. Each new note, each new share, increased both the wealth on paper and the fragility of the entire network. By the end of 1720, cracks had grown into visible fractures. The Mississippi Bubble, once a dazzling symbol of possibility, now revealed the perilous nature of paper wealth divorced from reality. The city of Paris teetered between hope and panic, and France itself approached the precipice of financial disaster. The question was no longer whether the system would fail, it was when and how devastating the consequences would be. In the winter of 1720, the illusion shattered. The Mississippi Bubble, which had fueled Parisian euphoria for over a year, burst with merciless speed. Share prices plummeted, confidence evaporated, and the streets of Paris descended into panic. Investors rushed to the Banque Royale, desperate to convert worthless paper into coins, only to find that the system could not sustain their demands. The fragile network of trust and speculation, once the engine of wealth, had finally failed. Chaos erupted. Aristocrats who had flaunted their Mississippi fortunes were reduced to desperation. Artisans lost their life savings, and even the previously confident merchants were paralyzed by shock. Riots broke out as angry citizens demanded repayment, while mobs gathered outside bank offices, fueled by fear and betrayal. The very fabric of social order trembled. Paper notes that had once symbolized power now symbolized ruin. John Law, once Paris's master of finance, became a hunted figure. His brilliance and audacity could not protect him from the consequences of overreach. He attempted to stabilize the market, issuing decrees to freeze transactions and reassure investors, but the wave of panic was unstoppable. In a matter of weeks, fortunes evaporated, confidence was destroyed, and Law fled the city to save his life. The man who had promised endless wealth was now a fugitive, leaving behind a nation reeling from his dream. The collapse had far-reaching effects. France's national debt remained enormous, now compounded by the public's distrust of both the government and financial institutions. Investors learned a harsh lesson. Paper wealth without tangible backing is a perilous gamble. Socially, the Mississippi bubble widened the divide between the elite and common citizens, many of whom had been drawn into the mania by promises of upward mobility. Yet the story did not end with Law's flight. The Mississippi bubble left an indelible mark on France and the world. Governments, financiers, and ordinary people had witnessed the power of speculation and paper money, as well as the dangers of unregulated financial innovation. The seeds of future financial systems, banks, stocks, and bubbles, were sown in these turbulent months. History would remember the Mississippi bubble not just as a disaster, but as a warning. Human ambition, imagination, and greed can conjure fortunes, but also obliterate them in an instant. By the close of 1720, Paris had returned to a wary calm. Streets once filled with speculation and laughter were subdued, businesses recovered slowly, and trust in financial experiments remained fragile for years. The Mississippi bubble had ended, but its lessons would echo through centuries of economic history, foreshadowing the crashes and booms that would follow across Europe and beyond.